Before the start of this video, if you are looking for any of these singles that I talk about today, make sure to check out my TCG Player affiliate link down below in the description. And by clicking on that link, and when you shop for those singles, I do get a small bonus. Another way you can support the channel is by becoming a patron member. There are some great benefits, as you can have your name on each video, you do have early access to videos, giveaways, deck advice and upgrades, and much more when you do join. And if anything else, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. That definitely goes a long way in supporting the channel. Hey, how's it going YouTube? This is Devin with PubStomp MTG, and it looks like we got another new version of the Mimeoplasm, and this is a classic Commander staple, at least the previous version. However, we do have a new updated version, which looks pretty sweet, especially with all the dinosaurs succumbing to all the ooze. And this is a Commander that is quite similar to the other. You're exiling cards in graveyard so that you could copy them with a Mimeoplasm. And so it is quite interesting. There's a little bit of a differences that I'll talk about later. However, I am pretty excited about this one, and so let's discuss it right away. So there are a couple differences between the older version of the Mimeoplasm and the new updated version. Reading into a Mimeoplasm Revered One, it has a mana value of X, black, green, and blue, legendary creature Ooze, with 0 power and 0 toughness. As it enters, exile up to X creature cards from your graveyard. It enters with 3 1/1 counters on it for each creature exiled this way. It does have an activated ability. By paying 2, Mimeoplasm becomes a copy of target creature card exiled with it, except as a 0/0 and has this ability. So this to me is more of an updated version compared to the old version. I do like how you're essentially making all those creatures that you did exile into one perfect specimen with the Mimeoplasm. And it does make sense with that last ability, except as a 0/0 and has this ability, because if you just exile those 3 cards, you're already going to have 9 1/1 counters on it. And if you make it a copy of another creature you control, let's just say a Galta, it'll be a 21/21. So it did make it a little bit more limited that way. Also, it's also a little bit more limited because you can only be one copy of one creature specifically, but you have that option of paying an additional 2 to make it another creature. And there are some neat combat tricks that you can use that I'll discuss a little bit later. So the Mimeoplasm is excellent. I think this is going to be a great commander, very reminiscent of the old one. Since this is mostly a creature deck, you can use Umori the Collector as your companion. It would fit right in with the Mimeoplasm. You don't have to do it. It's just a fun suggestion if you want to use a companion with it, and obviously being another ooze is pretty flavorful. But first of all, let's talk about self-mill, because we want to have creatures in our graveyard so that when the Mimeoplasm enters the battlefield, we can exile those creatures and the Mimeoplasm can become them. First up, this card I have been putting in more and more decks. This has been incredible for me, especially in those Reanimator decks. And that card is Ripples of Undeath. For 1 and a black, at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, mill 3 cards, then you may pay 1 mana and 3 life. If you do, you put a card from among those in your hand. As a 2 mana enchantment that just stays on the battlefield, this is going to immediately impact you as you go into your pre-combat main phase. And the longer the game goes on, the more you are going to mill cards, so that way you can feed it into the Mimeoplasm. This is just one of those enchantments that you must include. It's very cheap at the mana cost, and it's going to provide you immense value. The next card I would like to bring your attention to is Hermit Druid. Technically, this is not going to be a Hermit Druid combo deck. We do have more than a couple basic lands within the deck, so we're not going to mill our whole entire deck. This is just straight for value, because we could hit possibly like 5 to 10 cards off of one activation with the Hermit Druid. Another card that would seriously mill us that we could actually copy with the Mimeoplasm is Angel of Suffering. I like this card a lot because if damage would be dealt to you, prevent that damage and mill twice that many cards. So if people are going to be attacking us left and right, this can be a double-edged sword against us, but we can have an option of milling a lot of different cards into our graveyard, so that way when we do cast the Mimeoplasm, we have a great selection. But again, we do want to have a lot of engines in the deck, so that way we can mill as much cards as possible. Palantir of Orthanc is an excellent choice. This is a great card in my Sarn of the Dark Lord deck because it's flavorful and it does a lot for me. For 3 mana, at the beginning of your end step, put an influence counter on Palantir and scry 2. Then target opponent may have you draw a card. If that player doesn't, you mill X cards, where X is the number of influence counters on Palantir of Orthanc, and that player loses life equal to the total mana value of those cards. And let me tell you, it'll be an absolute mistake if your opponent decides to mill you, because there's a lot of big beefy creatures. And I'll discuss some of those creatures later on, but just fair warning, there's definitely a lot of big ones. And there are also a lot of other self-mill options in the deck. I just wanted to focus on a couple. I do have a deck list down below in the description if you want a template for yourself. But outside of that, we definitely want to take advantage of the graveyard outside of the Mimeoplasm, because we'll mill a lot of cards. And so now let's take a look at some of the graveyard synergies that we could take advantage of in the deck. So first of all, we can mill a lot of different creatures, but most likely we're going to be milling other spells or lands. And there may be some situations where you may be mana screwed, so you want to take advantage of Crucible of Worlds or even Conduit of the World Tree, where you can play lands from your graveyard to the battlefield. And especially if you have fetch lands, you'll never have to worry about lands unless you don't have those basic land types in your deck anymore. These are great easy includes. We're not necessarily in a landfall strategy, but this will just ensure that we can play lands every turn. The same can be applied for Walking Closet and Forgotten Cellar. It's a Crucible of Worlds on one side and a Yawgmoth's Will on the other. So if you want to activate the Forgotten Cellar side and cast all our other spells from the graveyard, we could easily do so, especially if we have a lot of mana lying around. Other options would be Aftermath Analyst, and you could throw in World Shaper too, because each of these basically do the same thing a little bit differently. Aftermath Analyst, when it enters the battlefield, you mill 3 cards, while World Shaper, when it does attack, you mill 3 cards, so slightly a little bit of a difference. But with Aftermath Analyst, when you do sacrifice it, you return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. And with World Shaper, essentially the same thing. When it does die, you return all land cards to the battlefield tapped. But what makes these two very important, what I like about them, is the fact that, especially with Aftermath Analyst, it has that activated ability of sacrificing itself. That is very important with the Mimeoplasm, just in case, hey, I found some better creatures in the graveyard that I want to exile with the Mimeoplasm. You have that way of sacrificing him, recasting him later on to exile those other cards. Again, we want to put as much lands on the battlefield as possible so we can pay into that X ability of our commander. So Hedge Shredder is probably one of the best options out of the bunch, mainly because of that second ability. Whenever one or more lands are put into the graveyard from your library, put them onto the battlefield tapped. And let me tell you something, this card is absolutely cracked in this deck, because most likely we're going to be milling a lot of lands, and we could just put them directly onto the battlefield with that ability. We don't necessarily have to worry about anything else with the vehicle side. I mean, it is nice when it does attack, you may mill 2 cards. That could be useful in some situations, but I like it for that other ability, because even if you mill like 3 cards with like Ripples of Undeath and 2 of those are lands, well, hey, you just put 2 cards on the battlefield and milled another card. That is what I call extreme value. Besides that point, I talked about self-mill and benefiting from the graveyard. Now I want to focus on some of the best creatures that you could copy with your commander. Starting off small, let's talk about everybody's favorite Cold-Eyed Selkie. This is infamous to draw a lot of cards. I like this particularly because if you exile it with your commander, let's just say you exile 2 other creatures, your commander would be a 9/9, and of course when Cold-Eyed Selkie deals combat damage to a player, you draw that many cards, which means you'll draw 9 cards, which would be quite insane. This does have Island Walk, so it does have that way of unblockable, especially if you have opponents that do have islands. This could be incredible for your deck. In a similar fashion, Cephalid Constable is another great option, because when it deals combat damage to a player, return up to that many target permanents that player controls to their owner's hand. So again, if you have a 9/9 on the battlefield with a Mimeoplasm and you copy Cephalid Constable, you're going to bounce that many permanents to that player's hand, which could be a whole board wipe in some situations. But enough of the value plays, let's get serious and talk about some game closers like Skithrix the Blight Dragon, or really any infect creature. I specifically focus on Skithrix, you could add in some other ones if you want to be a little bit more degenerate, because if you exile Skithrix with your commander, he'll essentially have flying and infect and have a way to regenerate it, and also gain haste too. So Skithrix is just a toolbox for you to close out games for sure, because if you just pay 4 mana into your commander, exiling 4 other creatures in your graveyard, you can make your commander a 12/12, and with Skithrix giving itself haste, you have that way of copying it by paying 2 mana, swinging in for 12 poison damage, and winning the game that way. Another card I find very fascinating in the deck is Sire of 7 Deaths. This is incredible mainly because of all the keyword soup that you do get along with this. You could have your commander get all those stats of First Strike, Vigilance, Menace, Trample, Reach, Lifelink, Ward, Pay 7 life. So obviously this had to be in there. It seems way too good, especially with our commander one. We want to go for some commander damage. But I will say this is actually not the scariest Eldrazi that you could throw in this deck. Even though Sire 7 Deaths is pretty scary, but there's nothing quite like Ulamog the Defiler. This is absolutely cracked in this deck, mainly because of the amount of counters you do put on your commander. Not only will your commander receive Ward, sacrifice 2 permanents, but it'll gain the text that it has Annihilator X, where X is the number of 1/1 counters on it, and let's just say we paid 4 mana into that X ability of our commander, making our commander a 12/12. Well, hey, guess what? Our commander will have Annihilator 12. And that seems a little bit too brutal, especially for my taste, even though I like to play it a little bit more degenerately. This is just straight up evil. You do also want to have ways of protecting your commander. You don't want to just rely on putting a big creature on the battlefield because somebody could remove it in response. You want to have ways to give your commander hexproof or even indestructible, and there's plenty of options, especially in Sultai color combination. But that is going to do for me, guys. Thank you guys so much for coming by and watching this video on the Mimeoplasm Revered One. This is one excellent commander. I like how it's an updated version of the Mimeoplasm. Let me know down below in the comments which one is better and which other cards would you suggest in this deck. I would love to hear your thoughts. Also, if you can, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. And with that out of the way, thank you for stomping by.